My name's Ray Poynter, and I'm going to talk to you for 15 to 20 minutes on an introduction and an overview to qualitative analysis, and hopefully provide a little bit of an introduction to Sue Bell, who's coming along next to talk about one of the more advanced topics, and who probably would be a much better person to speak to you about the introduction. But nevertheless, you've got me. So qualitative analysis, an introduction and an overview. So what is the agenda today? Well, first of all, we're going to describe what is qualitative data, because we don't, in common usage, often hear the word data and qualitative put together. What is qualitative analysis? Then I'm going to review some strategies for conducting qualitative analysis, suggest some further reading, and give you some closing thoughts. So, what do we mean by qualitative data? We mean everything that we might be using in a qualitative research project. So it can be verbatims in surveys. If you're running online forums and discussions, it's what people say in those. It's what people say in focus groups. But it's more than what people say, it's what people do in focus groups. The body language of the people in those groups, the collages they create, their response to projective tasks. Qualitative data can be videos of people, either videos you've collected as part of an ethnographic project, videos that people have collected themselves. They could be news footage. They can be photos collected for a research project, or photos from people's family albums. You sit down with somebody and go back through a family album. That is qualitative data. You might also collect together art. We often see art from other cultures as being indicative of those cultures, but of course our own art is indicative of our culture. Collectively, we often refer to these as artifacts. Discourses, any conversation. So we've got an in-depth interview. There is a discourse. Material in newspapers, material in books. These are all discourses. The chatter on the web is a discourse. What takes place when you're sitting on the bus is qualitative data. It's all part of the discourse. Films, books, magazines. The essential nature of it is that it's unstructured and it's real and it needs grappling with and immersing into to get an overall understanding. So what about qualitative analysis? Well, really, there are two fundamentally different ways of doing qualitative analysis. The first is you convert it to numbers. So we see people do that with verbatims. They'll take them and they'll code them and they will convert them to numbers. Word clouds is doing effectively the same sort of thing. It's taking how often something comes and it's creating something with a different number of pixels high and pixels wide. We see this with automated sentiment analysis. So all of that is taking qualitative data and not conducting qualitative analysis, it's conducting quantitative analysis. So what about qualitative? It's about finding the story in the data. It's about writing the story of the data. It's about the client understanding the story from that qualitative data. Now, story and narrative is the term that's used, are important concepts because there is no perfect narrative. There is no perfect story. There are some stories which are simply wrong and simply untrue. But there are many, many which can be useful, which can be illustrative, which can be revealing, which can get at the core essence of the information in that data. So we're looking for ways to find and to tell the story. It's not enough to find the story, you have to find and tell the story in order to be able to conduct qualitative analysis. Qualitative analysis starts during fieldwork. It can start before fieldwork in terms of when you're doing the preparation and the pre-reading, but it certainly starts in there. You may have a discussion guide when you're conducting a focus group, but you should never stick rigidly to it. You will be generating hypotheses in your head and you will want to test those. And you will think, oh, I see, it's mostly about saving money, is it? So you would ask questions that probe whether it really was about saving money, and when were the exceptions and when were the limitations on that. So all the time that you're conducting a group, you're doing that initial analysis. Similarly, if you're moderating an online forum or discussion, all the time you're conducting some analysis in your head, Frequently you will be tagging and coding if you're conducting it online. If you're doing an online focus group, you'll be tagging and conducting. Generally speaking, if you're moderating a face-to-face event, most authorities would say don't take notes during that. You might take the odd little scribbled thing just to jog your memory to come back. Hopefully you'll be video recording the group anyway, so you'll be able to go back and check your points. When we're doing it online, we have the luxury of being able to tag and code as we go along. If we've got an online focus group, you're not the only person that will be doing the analysis during that group. You may well have observers behind the glass. It's a great idea to tell them to take notes, to say, I want you to write down what you think you see. I want you to write down how it makes you feel. And that is too is going to be part of the qualitative data. The notes your observers take and the conversation you have with them afterwards, that is part of the qualitative data that you're going to be using. So note-taking is important. We come together afterwards. There are some specific cases. We talk about body language quite a lot in qualitative research. One of the important things about it is how does that turn into data? It's the notes you take. Obviously, if you've got a video recording of it, they will exist in the video recording, but you're not going to be able to process that in quite the same way, so you need to take notes. There's a great section, one of the good books in this area is Good Thinking by Wendy Gordon. And in the book, she talks about, for example, projective techniques, where you're getting people to project their feelings onto objects and exercises. She then strongly recommends that you get them to interpret it. You don't look at their drawings, you don't look at their personifications and try to intuit them yourself. You get them to explain and say, right, now looking at that, how would you explain that to a managing director? What is it that's made you think that is showing through here? And we have that sort of discussion, and you write notes about that. So those notes become partly the qualitative analysis, but partly the qualitative data. So all of that is gathering and we're moving forward. Once we've finished the study, we've been doing some analysis as the study goes along, we need to bring all the information together and we need to organize it. And this is probably one of the strengths of programs like NVivo, that they're really good at organizing your different bits of data, your photographs and your text and your transcripts and so on, bring them all together and to put them into there. When I started in research back in the 70s, the most common technique that the qualitative researchers seemed to use in those days was shoeboxes. Several of my colleagues have got lots of projects and they would file them in shoeboxes. We have moved on a long way since then. We can organize things online, we can organize them in software, but some people still persist with paper and pencil and journals. You'll see sometimes people with scissors cutting things up and reorganizing them. But whatever it is, you need to organize that so that you've got all of your material, all your qualitative data accessible to you. And then it doesn't matter really what type, and there are several schools of qualitative analysis and several different schools of how you go about it, but you want to do a really close examination of your data, a very, very close reading of what's there. And annotate is really important. Now, not everybody does this all the time. We were joking a little bit before. To some extent, when you've been doing it long enough, you become a little bit lighter in the annotation. You will still do some. You will often do some online stuff and some clipping and linking. But certainly if you're starting out in the process, make sure that you are using the highlighter pen, that you are using the post-its, that you are annotating things as you go through. What exactly you're looking for will depend on the research question. You set up the research design to answer the research objectives. The research objectives were grounded in the business objectives. So when we come to the analysis, we're going to be looking at those research questions and those research objectives. So this little list here will vary a bit from project to project. But in terms of the things that you're going to be looking for in your data, in your transcripts, in your discourses you've collected, in your recordings are, who are the actors? So I remember doing a piece of analysis on some downloaded conversation from my Starbucks idea. So we were identifying owners, competitors, baristas, customers, ex-customers. All of these were the actors actors that were taking part. Some of the actors are present, they are first person, some of the actors are being spoken about as close, some are theoretical. So you want this definition of who are the actors in this. The actors may be hoodies, the actors may be mums, the actors may be children, the actors may be spoilt children. Then we have the objects that are being talked about. So we may have 4 or 5 different references to carrots and parsnips and so on, and we'll group that together and say, oh, it's clearly an object there which is vegetable. Or maybe the object is food, because the level of abstraction is going to vary depending on what we see. What are the actions that are taking place? Giving, receiving, working with, all these sort of things. What are the actions taking part in that discourse? What are the emotions? Satisfaction, fear, safety, warmth. These are the sort of things we're looking for there. Footing. Are people being subtly defensive? Whenever we talk about healthy food, do we notice that the conversation has shifted to a defensive footing? Or I would like to do that, but instead of I do, I would like to do. And we notice that the footing has changed in there. Ideas. What are the ideas that people are talking about? Are they aspirational ideas? Are they political ideas? Are they food ideas? Whatever is relevant, we're pulling all those together. And the two things we're doing typically, there are much more extensive methods. I'm going to talk about grounded theory in a moment. But generally speaking, we're looking to draw together codes. We want to take those several references to different vegetables and we're going to code that as vegetables. We might code different, people talk about, for example, in a study on IT, they might be talking about Internet Explorer and Opera and Chrome, and we might code those as browsers. Or we might code something as browser errors. We might code something as satisficing. So there's a variety of codes that we're going to put together in that, and we're going to write memos around them. So as we start to work through this data, typically you're going to go through this data several times, not once from the top to the bottom, but you're going to go through the data several times and you're going to add memos to that. This is what I thought it meant. I need to look for this so that when you come back to that memo the second time through, you might scribble a bit of it out or you might add something to it to refresh it, because you're trying to build bigger and bigger categories and concepts out of the codes that are in the data that you can see. It's really important. If I hear one very common criticism of qualitative research from clients, it's that they are simply telling me what people in the focus group said. They're simply telling me what people in the online discussion said. What we need to do is we need to interpret. And there's a couple of examples from another good book on qualitative research, Chaim Polsky from the US. If somebody in the group says, I'll use it on vacation, you should think to yourself, they can't think of a reason why they'd use this in their everyday life. And you probably want to probe then and see if that crops up, if you can evidence that challenge to the statement elsewhere in the information. I'd give it as a gift. Are they really saying it's not for me? Let's have a look and see if we can follow that through in the data. And in terms of coding, here's a nice example from High. Bad reporting of this sort of information. 2 participants felt the brand was like a BMW, 3 like a Mercedes, 1 like a Porsche. He would say, you've really got to see that and report that as the brand is perceived as premium and European. Do that interpretation. That is why we are there. We're not there simply to slice and dice the words that the customers, the participants have used in the exercises. Once you've got those codes and those memos, it's about trying to recognize which bits of the jigsaw you've got. And unfortunately, the data you get from a qualitative exercise is quite a complicated one, in that it's like somebody has taken half a dozen jigsaws together, mixed them up, taken some of the pieces away, and you're trying to find the jigsaw about the train in the station. So you're pulling the pieces out and saying, does this piece of jigsaw belong to this problem? If so, I'll put it over there. If it doesn't, I'll put it to one side. Now, I've got some pieces missing, but can I make the overall picture with those pieces of jigsaw? And I'm looking at the story and I'm teasing it around in different ways. I'm looking at, I'm challenging my memos, I'm challenging my codes to see if it's going to work in that way. At that stage, and people do disagree on exactly where they do this point, but at that stage, start looking to see if there are different stories within the data based on male versus female, young versus old, the first focus group versus the second focus group, which tends to mean that you did something differently between them. Because remember, you are part of this data. Are there differences by group? So I'm a strong believer in looking at the whole picture and then finding out where the whole picture is not true, where it has to be differentiated by people. The next thing to do is how we create that story, and we bring together two very, very different attitudes. So this is Hans Christian Andersen, the statue of him anyway. So we need to bring together the storyteller. Now we've found the information, how do we turn the information into a story that has a narrative flow that creates insight and illuminates the problem? So we do that with storytelling skills. But we do something else. We bring the discipline of the sciences, the physicists, to it, because what physicists always try to do is disprove the theory. So it's all about trying to disprove it. So having created a story, we then go through and we look for disconfirming cases. We think this is the case, but actually we go back into the discussion and we find out that sometimes people don't say that. Sometimes they seem to be doing this, and we keep challenging our story until we think we have a robust narrative that explains what's going on. Which brings us to, how do clients trust qualitative research? How should they rely on the findings? So the first is the story, the narrative, is it coherent? Can you understand it? Is it comprehensive? Does it include everything of merit that's in the data? And is it believable? So it has to do those things first. The second is it has to be useful. It has to provide some information that the client can use to make a better decision. And does it triangulate? Does it confirm with something that is already known? Does it confirm with a psychological model? Does it confirm with behavioral economics? That say, yes, this story is likely to be true because it's consistent with other messages. So a quick analogy. We get a big pile of Lego and we're told, okay, what was the child trying to make? So we try different ideas. We come up with a story that says it's like this. We then have a look and we say, well, it came out of that Lego box. Look at the pictures on the Lego box. Yes, that triangulates. It's now a coherent story. Further reading, grounded theory is a very precise method of doing the sort of things that I've talked about. Incredibly time consuming. It's well worth doing a few times, but you wouldn't do it in most commercial research. It's a version of a more general approach, the indicator concept model, again worth looking at. Content analysis. Discourse analysis is one of my favorites, and I'm very much looking forward to the next presentation, which is from Sue Bell, on that. And semiotics. What do these things mean as signs, and how should they be interpreted? So all of these can be pulled together. But I want to leave you with 4 thoughts. The first one is that we have to create a compelling narrative that illuminates the client's business problem. It doesn't really matter how good everything else is. If we do not create the narrative at the end of the process, then it will have failed. We have to do that. Don't just say what the participants said. Interpret. We're not there to simply take notes and repeat and regurgitate. You need to make sure your findings are grounded in the data. Sometimes I've seen findings presented, and when you really challenge, the person who's delivering them is quite sure they're true, but they saw no evidence for it in the groups they conducted. There is nothing in the transcripts that actually support that. And that shouldn't be sold as market research, that should be sold as business consultancy. And finally, the client should already know the answer. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you've got it right and you explain it to the client, they'll often say, oh, we already knew that. And the answer is yes, but you didn't know that you knew it until we had this research and this story unlocked it. If we tell you the story and it's a complete surprise to you after we've told you the story, then probably the story isn't quite right. You should, at some level, if you are talking to a client who is involved in a marketplace, at some level they will know the answer. We need to unlock it so that they get access to that answer. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.